The dust cloud from the stagecoach had barely settled when Margaret Hayes stepped onto the cracked earth of Dust Hollow's main street. Her traveling dress, once crisp and proper, now bore the grime of 3 days' journey from St. Louis. She pulled her worn leather valise closer, its weight a reminder of everything she owned in this world, which wasn't much anymore. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dying town. Margaret counted maybe 24 buildings lining the street, half of them boarded up, a general store with faded lettering, a saloon that had seen better days, and what might have been a hotel once upon a time, the kind of place people passed through, not where they chose to stop. She'd heard there might be work here, some ranches still operating. Someone had said back in Dodge City. It was her last lead, her last hope before the money ran out entirely. A cowboy was mending a fence post near the edge of town, his back to her. Margaret watched him work for a moment, steady, methodical movements that spoke of years of practice. His hat was pulled low against the sun, shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal arms bronzed by outdoor labor. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice smaller than intended in the vast emptiness. The man straightened slowly, as if his back protested the movement. When he turned, Margaret saw a face weathered by sun and wind, probably no more than 35 years, with eyes the color of prairie sky after rain. Those eyes studied her with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Ma'am," he acknowledged, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it much. Margaret swallowed her pride, what little remained of it. "I'm looking for work. Is there anything available here?" The cowboy's gaze traveled from her city boots to her too fine dress to the small hands that had only ever known ledgers and typewriters. "You lost, miss?" "No, sir. I'm exactly where I meant to be." She lifted her chin slightly. "I heard some ranches might need help." A dry laugh escaped him. "Help doing what exactly? You ever mucked a stall, branded cattle, mended harness leather?" "I can learn." "That's what they all say." He turned back to his fence. "Best catch the next stage out. Nothing here for city folk." Margaret felt the last of her hope crumbling like the dried mud beneath her feet. She'd spent her last dollar on the ticket here. There was no next stage, no going back. "I kept books for Hartwell and Associates in St. Louis for 6 years, she said to his back. "I can calculate interest in my head, balance ledgers, negotiate contracts. I know that's not much use with cattle, but surely someone needs—" "Nobody here's got money for bookkeepers." He drove a nail into the post with more force than necessary. Margaret stood there another moment, watching him work. Pride warred with desperation. Desperation won. "1 week," she said quietly. "Give me 1 week, no wages. If I can't prove myself useful by then, I'll leave." The hammering stopped. The cowboy turned again, this time really looking at her. Margaret met his gaze steadily, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You got any idea what you're asking? This ain't St. Louis. Work starts before dawn, ends after dark. It's hard, dirty, and thankless. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Aren't you?" He studied her soft hands, her pale complexion. "When's the last time you went to bed hungry, or woke up with frost on your blanket?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. "That's Samuel Morgan's spread, about 2 miles north." He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. "He might be fool enough to take you on. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've gotten yourself into." "Your name, sir?" He hesitated. "Morgan. Samuel Morgan." "You just said—" "I know what I said." He pulled his hat lower. 2 miles north. Big white house, can't miss it. Or you can wait here for tomorrow's eastbound stage. Margaret watched him gather his tools and head toward a horse tied to a hitching post. She called after him. "I'll take the ranch." He paused, one foot in the stirrup. "Your funeral, miss." "Oh, Margaret Hayes," she supplied, "and I'll see you in the morning. Mr. Morgan." He swung into the saddle without another word. But Margaret caught something in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest hint of respect. Then he was riding away, leaving her standing alone in the dusty street with her valise and her determination. The walk to the ranch took nearly an hour. Margaret's boots, made for city sidewalks, rubbed blisters on her heels. The valise grew heavier with each step, but she kept walking, past scrub brush and prairie grass, following the rutted wagon track north. The Morgan Ranch, when it finally came into view, made her heart sink. The big white house had probably been white 20 years ago. Now it was gray with neglect, paint peeling like old scabs. The barn looked solid enough, and she could see cattle dotting the distant pasture, but everything had an air of barely hanging on. She found Samuel Morgan in the barn, brushing down his horse. He didn't look surprised to see her. "You walked?" was all he said. "You didn't offer a ride? Figured you'd turn back." "I don't turn back, Mr. Morgan." He continued brushing the horse in long, steady strokes. "There's a room off the kitchen. Used to be for the cook, back when we had one. Roof leaks when it rains, but it's got a bed and a stove. You'll take your meals with the hands, such as they are. Work starts at 4:30. What would you have me do?" "Whatever needs doing. We're short-handed since the last man quit, and can you milk?" "I can learn." "Can you cook?" "Passably." "Can you keep your mouth shut and your opinions to yourself?" Margaret bristled. "When necessary." Samuel finally looked at her directly. Up close, she could see lines of grief etched around his eyes, a weariness that went bone deep. "Why are you really here, Miss Hayes? What's a woman like you doing in a place like this?" She could have lied, spun some tale of adventure or family connections. Instead, she found herself speaking the truth. "Because I have nowhere else to go. The company I worked for folded. My reputation went with it. Apparently, bookkeepers are blamed when the books reveal theft. I've applied everywhere from Chicago to Denver. This is the end of the line." Something shifted in his expression. "The end of the line." He repeated it like he understood the weight of those words. "Well, Miss Hayes, welcome to Dust Hollow. Try not to die of disappointment." He led her to the small room, which was exactly as grim as promised. A narrow bed with a straw mattress, a pot-bellied stove, a washstand with a cracked pitcher. The window looked out on the chicken coop. "The hands eat at 6. That's Will Hartley. He's 60 if he's a day, but still works circles around men half his age. And Tom Brennan, barely 16, but thinks he knows everything. I do the hiring and firing, but Will runs the day-to-day. You'll answer to him." "And the books? Surely you keep records." "Such as they are." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Haven't had time for proper bookkeeping since in a while." "Since his wife died," Margaret guessed, noting the sudden closure in his voice. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror after father passed. "I'll settle in then," she said quietly. "Thank you for the chance." He paused at the door. "1 week. Miss Hayes, don't make me regret it." After he left, Margaret sank onto the hard bed and finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. What had she done? Trading her small city room for this? Her hands were soft. Her back already ached from the walk, and she had no idea how to milk a cow. But she was here now, the end of the line, perhaps, but still breathing, still fighting. Tomorrow would come at 4:30 whether she was ready or not. Margaret Hayes unpacked her few belongings, 2 dresses, a photograph of her parents, her father's watch, and the letter of recommendation from her previous employer that was worth less than the paper it was written on. She hung her dresses on nails in the wall, placed the photograph on the windowsill, and wound the watch carefully before tucking it under her pillow. Then she went to find the kitchen and see what she could do about supper. If she was going to prove herself useful, she might as well start now. The sun was setting over Dust Hollow, painting the dying grass gold and casting long shadows from the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Margaret squared her shoulders and got to work. The rooster's crow came too soon, piercing through the thin walls of Margaret's room while the world outside remained ink black. She fumbled for her father's watch. 4 o'clock. Her body protested as she swung her legs over the side of the narrow bed. Every muscle ached from yesterday's walk, and the straw mattress had done little to help. She dressed quickly in her plainest frock, though even that seemed absurdly fine for what lay ahead. In the kitchen, she found the stove cold and the coffee pot empty. First test. Then, by the time Boots stomped on the porch 30 minutes later, Margaret had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven, though she'd burned her first batch and had to start over. Will Hartley entered first, a grizzled man with kind eyes beneath bushy brows. Young Tom Brennan followed, all gangly limbs and suspicious glances. "Well, I'll be," Will muttered, pouring himself coffee. "Samuel said he'd hired a bookkeeper, not a cook." "I'm both, apparently," Margaret replied, trying not to wince as she pulled the biscuits out. They were lopsided but edible. Tom snorted. "City girl making breakfast. This ought to be rich." "Tom," Will warned quietly. To Margaret, he said, "Don't mind the boy, he's got no manners since his ma passed." Samuel entered last, and Margaret noticed how the other men straightened slightly. He surveyed the simple breakfast without comment, but she caught him glancing at her flour-dusted hands. "After breakfast, Will'll show you the milking," he said. "We've got 6 cows need tending before we move the herd to the east pasture." Margaret nodded, though her stomach churned at the thought. She'd seen cows, of course, but always from the safe distance of a carriage window. An hour later, she stood in the barn facing a brown and white cow named Bessie. According to Will, the animal looked enormous up close, switching her tail and eyeing Margaret with what seemed like skepticism. "Everything about milking is rhythm," Will explained, demonstrating on the next cow over. "Firm but gentle. Can't be scared of her, or she'll know." Margaret's first attempts were disasters. Her hands, accustomed to pen and paper, couldn't find the right pressure. Milk sprayed sideways, hitting her skirt. Bessie shifted restlessly, nearly knocking over the pail. "Like this," Will corrected patiently, guiding her hands. "See? Squeeze and pull. Squeeze and pull." By the 3rd cow, Margaret's forearms burned. Them by the 6th, her back screamed in protest. But the pail was full, and she'd managed not to spill it. Much. "Not bad for a first-timer," Will admitted. "Though you might want to change that dress." Margaret looked down at her milk-splattered, dirt-stained frock and almost laughed. Her fine city clothes lasting a week. Unlikely. The day continued relentlessly. After milking came egg collecting. The hens pecked at her hands, drawing blood. Then Tom showed her how to fork hay, smirking when she could barely lift the pitchfork. By noon, when they broke for dinner, Margaret's palms were raw and blistered. She served cold beef and bread, her hands shaking with exhaustion. The men ate quickly, discussing the afternoon's work, moving cattle, mending more fence, checking water troughs. Samuel watched her struggle to cut her meat with blistered hands, but said nothing. "I'll need you in the house this afternoon," he finally said. "Time you saw those books you're so keen on." The ranch office was a small room off the main parlor, dusty and cluttered. Papers covered every surface, receipts, bills, correspondence, all jumbled together. Margaret stared at the chaos, understanding dawning. "My wife kept the books," Samuel said quietly from the doorway. "Haven't had the heart to touch them since she passed. 2 years now. 2 years of financial neglect." Margaret's trained eye spotted overdue notices, unopened bank statements, bills paid twice or not at all. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the desk. He shrugged and left her to it. Margaret lost herself in the familiar world of numbers and ledgers. This, at least, she understood. She sorted papers by date, by creditor, by type. The picture that emerged made her heart sink. The ranch was drowning. Debts to the feed store, the bank, the railroad, income from cattle sales, when she could find records of them, barely covered operating costs. And the prices, dear Lord, the prices they were getting for beef were criminal. "Find anything interesting?" She looked up to find Samuel in the doorway, the late afternoon sun casting shadows across his face. "You're being robbed," she said bluntly. "These prices from the stockyard, they're paying you half what beef's worth in Kansas City. Only stockyard for 100 miles. They know we got no choice." "There's always a choice." Margaret pulled out a sheet of calculations. "What if you sold directly to the hotels in Dodge, or contracted with the army posts? The freight costs would be higher, but—" "You think I haven't tried?" His voice hardened. "You've been here one day. Miss Hayes, don't presume to understand our situation." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Of course, I apologize." He studied her for a long moment. "Show me the numbers." They worked until supper, Margaret explaining her findings while Samuel provided context she couldn't have known. The corrupt stockyard agent who had the sheriff in his pocket, the failed attempt to drive cattle to better markets. They'd lost half the herd to drought. "We're not the only ones," he said. "Half the ranches in the county are failing. Dust Hollow's dying. Miss Hayes has been for years. But it doesn't have to," she insisted, "if the ranchers work together." "Together?" He laughed bitterly. "John Martinez and I haven't spoken in 3 years. The Hendersons blame me for the water rights dispute, and old Collins would rather lose his ranch than admit he needs help." Margaret heard the pain beneath the anger. This wasn't just about money, it was about a community torn apart by hardship and pride. That evening, she served a better supper. She'd found dried beans and salt pork, made something resembling a stew. Her blistered hands could barely hold the ladle, but she managed. "Not bad, city girl," Tom admitted grudgingly. "My name is Miss Hayes," she said mildly. "Sure it is," he muttered, but she caught him sneaking a second helping. After the hands retired, Margaret found Samuel on the porch, smoking a pipe and staring at the stars. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the other chair. He nodded. They sat in silence for a while. The night sounds of the prairie surrounded them, crickets, distant cattle, the wind through grass. "Your hands hurt?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes." "They'll toughen up, or you'll quit." "I don't quit, Mr. Morgan." "We'll see." More silence. Then, "Why'd you really hire me? You could have said no this morning." He took a long draw on his pipe. "Maybe I was curious. Been a long time since anyone looked at this place and saw possibility instead of failure. I still see it. And that's 'cause you've only been here a day." Margaret flexed her aching fingers. "My father used to say that books don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth either. They show what is, not what could be. Your father sounds like an optimist." "He was right until the end." She stood, wrapping her shawl tighter. "Good night, Mr. Morgan." "Miss Hayes," she turned back. "Wear gloves tomorrow for the milking." It was as close to kindness as she'd gotten all day. That night, Margaret soaked her blistered hands in cold water from the pitcher. Every muscle ached. Her dress was likely ruined, and tomorrow would be just as hard. But she'd made it through one day. She'd milked cows and collected eggs and begun to untangle 2 years of financial chaos. More importantly, she'd glimpsed something beneath Samuel Morgan's harsh exterior. A man struggling to hold on to his legacy while his world crumbled around him. And a town full of proud, stubborn people who'd rather fail alone than succeed together. Margaret Hayes had found more than a job in Dust Hollow. She'd found a challenge worthy of her father's optimism. She fell asleep planning tomorrow's breakfast and dreaming of ledgers balanced and neighbors reconciled. The rooster would crow again at 4, and she'd be ready. Or at least, she'd pretend to be. By the end of her first week, Margaret's hands bore thick calluses and her city dresses had been retired in favor of a practical cotton frock Mrs. Henderson had sold her from the general store. She'd mastered milking, could scatter chicken feed without flinching at the pecking, and had even learned to drive the wagon to town for supplies. But it was the ledgers that consumed her evenings. By lamplight, after the supper dishes were done, she pored over 2 years of financial records, building a clear picture of the ranch's predicament and potential. "You planning to go blind staring at those numbers?" Samuel asked one night, finding her hunched over the desk. "I'm planning to save your ranch," she replied without looking up. "If you'll let me." He pulled up a chair. "I'm listening." Margaret spread out her carefully prepared sheets. "The stockyard's paying you $12 a head. The same cattle sell for $25 in Dodge City, $30 in Kansas City, even accounting for transportation costs. We can't drive cattle that far. Not enough hands, and the drought last year proved. I'm not talking about driving them." Margaret pulled out another paper. "I'm talking about negotiating a better price here, but not just for you, for all the ranchers." Samuel's expression darkened. "I told you, we don't work together. Because you're all too proud to admit you need each other." She met his gaze steadily. "What if someone else did the talking? Someone who wasn't part of your feuds?" "You? I spent 6 years negotiating contracts in St. Louis. I know how to read men like Harold Watson at the stockyard. He's counting on your isolation, your desperation. But if 5 ranches stood together, you'd never get Martinez to the same table as me, or Collins to admit he needs help. Want to bet?" Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe even amusement. "You've been here a week, Miss Hayes. Long enough to see what's killing this town. And it isn't drought or distance, it's pride." The next morning, Margaret drove the wagon to town alone. Samuel had protested, but she'd insisted. She had 3 stops to make, and none of them would be easy. First, the Martinez Ranch. Juan Martinez was working on a broken wheel when she pulled up. His eyes narrowed at the Morgan brand on the wagon. "Mr. Martinez, I'm Margaret Hayes. I keep books for the Morgan Ranch." "I know who you are." His accent was slight, his suspicion heavy. "Samuel send you?" "No, I came on my own. About the stockyard prices." "Nothing to discuss. We all get robbed equal." "What if you didn't have to?" Margaret climbed down from the wagon, grateful her new boots were sturdy. "What if you could get $18 a head instead of 12? Juan's hands stilled on the wheel. "Keep talking." She did, for 20 minutes. She laid out her plan: collective bargaining, shared transportation costs, quality guarantees that would justify higher prices. Juan listened, occasionally asking sharp questions that showed he understood more about business than most gave him credit for. "Why should I trust a Morgan employee?" "Because I'm not from here. Your feuds mean nothing to me. Your children going hungry because of bad prices? That means everything." Juan's face softened slightly at the mention of children. Margaret had seen them playing in the yard, 3 boys and a girl, all thin as rails. "I'll think about it," he said finally. But Samuel Morgan sets foot on my land and he won't. This is business, Mr. Martinez, not personal. The Collins ranch was harder. Edward Collins was 70 if he was a day, stubborn as his mules and twice as mean. He laughed when Margaret explained her plan. "You little girl playing at business. You think you can waltz in here and fix what's been broken for years? I think you're too smart to let pride cost you everything you've built." Margaret shot back. "Your grandson Bobby, he's what, 16? What happens to him when you lose this place?" The old man's face went red. "You threatening me? I'm offering you a chance. There's a difference." She left with his promise to consider it, which was more than she'd hoped for. The Henderson Ranch was her last stop. Paul Henderson received her coolly but listened. His wife, Ellen, brought coffee and stayed to hear the plan. "It could work," Ellen said quietly when Margaret finished. "If the men could set aside their grudges." Paul shot his wife a look. "The water rights were settled 2 years ago," Ellen interrupted. "When it's time to move forward, Paul." Margaret seized the opening. "Mrs. Henderson's right. Whatever happened before, you're all facing the same threat now. Watson's getting rich while you're all barely surviving." "When would this meeting be?" Paul asked grudgingly. "Thursday. Neutral ground, the church in town. Pastor Williams has agreed to host." She'd secured the pastor's cooperation that morning, appealing to his concern for his shrinking congregation. Empty ranches meant empty pews. The drive back to the Morgan Ranch felt longer than usual. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities and pitfalls. She'd planted seeds, but would they grow? Samuel was waiting on the porch. How'd it go? "They'll come, I think." "You think?" "I know Martinez will, Collins, maybe Henderson will if his wife has anything to say about it." Samuel shook his head. "You've got no idea what you're stirring up." "Then tell me." She sat beside him, suddenly weary. "What happened between you and Martinez?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "His oldest boy, Miguel. Sweet on my Alice before I married her. When she chose me," he shrugged. "Juan took it personal. Then came the water rights dispute, and things got worse. After Alice died, he sent condolences. I sent them back unopened. Couldn't bear anything that reminded me of her. Margaret's heart ached for all of them. The grieving widower, the rejected suitor, the woman caught between them now gone. That's the past," she said gently. "This is about the future. Some things don't stay buried, Miss Hayes." Thursday arrived gray and threatening rain. Margaret dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, pinned her hair severely back, and armed herself with ledgers and calculations. The church was small, whitewashed boards and simple pews. Pastor Williams, a thin man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. "I hope you know what you're doing, Miss Hayes." "So do I," she murmured. Martinez arrived first, alone. Then the Hendersons, Ellen's hand firm on her husband's arm. Collins shuffled in last, grumbling about fool notions. Samuel entered just as Margaret stood to begin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "A gentleman," Margaret began before anyone could speak. "And Mrs. Henderson, thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." "Damn right it ain't," Collins muttered. Margaret opened her ledger. "Let me show you something. Mr. Martinez, you sold 40 head last month for $12 each. That's $480. Mr. Collins, 30 head for $360. Mr. Henderson, 50 head for $600. Mr. Morgan, 45 head for $540. She paused. "Harold Watson made approximately $600 profit on your cattle alone in 1 month." The room was silent. "Together you sold 165 head. If you'd negotiated as a group, demanded $17 minimum, that's $2,805. split fairly by contribution. Mr. Martinez would have made $700. Mr. Collins, $525. We get it, Paul Henderson interrupted. But Watson won't pay more just because we ask nice. No. But he will if the alternative is no cattle at all. Margaret pulled out another paper. There's a buyer in Dodge City willing to pay $22 a head if we can guarantee regular delivery. Transportation costs would be $3 per head if we share wagons. $19 net, Juan calculated quickly, to $7 more than Watson pays. If we work together, Margaret emphasized. Separate, we don't have enough cattle to interest the Dodge buyer. Together we do. What's your cut? Collins asked suspiciously. Nothing. I'm paid to keep Mr. Morgan's books, then if his ranch prospers, I keep my position. And if we can't stand each other long enough to make this work, Paul asked, not looking at Samuel. Ellen Henderson spoke up. Then our children learn that pride tastes better than bread. The room fell silent again. Margaret waited, knowing she'd pushed as far as she could. Finally, Juan Martinez stood. I'm in, for my children. Paul Henderson nodded slowly. Us too. All eyes turned to Collins. The old man glared at each of them in turn, then spat into his handkerchief. Fine, but I ain't shaking no hands. I'll draw up the agreements, Margaret said quickly. We'll need to elect a representative to negotiate with buyers. You do it, Juan said. Samuel's head snapped up, but Juan continued. You know the numbers. You got no history with any of us. Makes sense. The others nodded agreement, even Collins. As the meeting dispersed, Margaret overheard Ellen Henderson whisper to her husband. That girl's got more spine than all of you put together. Samuel waited until the others had gone. You did it. We did it. The first step, anyway. They'll probably kill each other before the first delivery. Maybe. Or maybe they'll remember what it's like to be neighbors. He studied her for a long moment. You're not what I expected, Margaret Hayes. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest, but kept her voice steady. Neither are you, Samuel Morgan. They drove back to the ranch in companionable silence. The threatening rain had held off, and tentative sun broke through the clouds. It felt like an omen. That night, Margaret allowed herself a small celebration, an extra spoonful of sugar in her coffee and a few minutes on the porch watching the stars. She'd done it, brought together feuding neighbors, created opportunity from stubbornness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the contracts to draft, the Dodge City buyer to contact, the delicate balance of personalities to maintain. But tonight, she'd won a victory for Dust Hollow, and maybe, just maybe, for herself too. The first cooperative cattle drive to Dodge City was scheduled for the last week of October. Margaret spent the intervening weeks in a whirlwind of activity, drafting contracts, negotiating terms with the buyer, coordinating schedules among the ranchers. The initial wariness between the neighbors hadn't disappeared, but necessity kept them civil. Never thought I'd see the day, Will Hartley mused, watching Juan Martinez and Samuel discuss road conditions by the corral. Those two ain't shared more than hard words in 3 years. Margaret smiled, tallying the week's egg production. Money has a way of healing old wounds. Maybe, or maybe it's something else got them talking. The old foreman gave her a knowing look before ambling off. The cooperative was working better than anyone had dared hope. The Dodge buyer, impressed by their organization and quality guarantees, had increased his order. Other ranchers, seeing the success, inquired about joining. Even Harold Watson at the local stockyard had grudgingly raised his prices, though still not enough to compete with their new arrangement. But it was the change in Dust Hollow itself that struck Margaret most. The general store reported better sales. The blacksmith had more work shoeing horses for the longer drives. Mrs. Henderson had started a quilting circle, bringing together ranch wives who hadn't spoken in years. "You've done something remarkable," Pastor Williams told her after Sunday service. "This town was dying. Now there's life again." Margaret demurred, but privately felt a glow of satisfaction. She'd found her purpose here, far from the offices of St. Louis. One evening in early November, she was reconciling accounts when Samuel appeared with 2 cups of coffee. It had become their routine, an hour of quiet conversation after the day's work was done. "Ryder came by today," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "From the Farmers' Bank in Dodge. They heard about our cooperative." Margaret looked up sharply. "And?" "They're interested in extending credit, better terms than we've seen in years." "Samuel, that's wonderful. With proper financing, we could improve the breeding stock, maybe even dig that new well." "Margaret." Something in his tone stopped her. "There's more. They want to meet the person who organized all this, in person." She set down her pen. "When?" "Next week. You could ride along with the cattle drive, handle both pieces of business." A trip to Dodge City meant 3 days away, 2 nights in hotels. It meant leaving the safety of her established routine, but it also meant opportunity for better credit terms, for new buyers, for growth. "I'll go," she said. Samuel's relief was visible. "Good. I'll be going too. Someone needs to oversee the drive." They'd been careful these past weeks, maintaining proper distance despite the warmth growing between them. But a trip together, even on business, felt like crossing an invisible line. The night before departure, Margaret was packing her valise when a knock came at her door. Ellen Henderson stood outside, holding a wrapped bundle. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing it over. Margaret unwrapped it to find a traveling suit, practical but well-made, in deep blue wool. "Ellen, I can't." "You're representing all of us in Dodge. Can't have you looking like you've been mucking stalls." Ellen's eyes twinkled. "Besides, it's an investment. When you impress those bankers, we all benefit." Margaret hugged her impulsively. "Thank you. Just remember us when you're tempted by city life again." Ellen said softly, "This town needs you." Margaret. More than you know. The morning of departure dawned crisp and clear. 5 wagons loaded with cattle waited in the town square. Morgan, Martinez, Henderson, Collins, and the Sawyers who joined last minute. The ranchers had elected Samuel as trail boss, a vote of confidence that still amazed Margaret. She climbed onto the wagon seat beside Samuel, aware of eyes watching. Propriety dictated she should ride with one of the married couples, but practicality and the need to discuss business won out. "Ready?" Samuel asked. "Ready." The first day passed in dust and monotony. Margaret discovered that cattle drives, while necessary, were far from the romantic adventures described in novels. The beasts moved slowly, complained constantly, and required constant vigilance to keep together. But there was something peaceful about the vast prairie, the rhythm of wheels and hooves, the wide sky stretching endlessly above. Samuel taught her to read the weather in cloud formations, to identify plants and their uses, to understand the subtle signs of the land. "You love it out here," she observed as they made camp that evening. He was quiet for a moment, stirring the fire. "My grandfather came west in '49, said he was looking for gold but found something better, land that was his, far as he could see. My father built the ranch. I was supposed to—" He trailed off. "Build it bigger, make it prosper. I pass it on." The words were heavy with grief. "Alice and I, we tried for children. When she died, took that dream with her. Margaret's heart ached for him. Dreams can change shape, Samuel. The ranch will survive because of what we're doing now. That's a legacy, too. He looked at her across the fire, and something passed between them, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. The second day brought challenges. A wheel broke on the Henderson wagon. Cattle spooked at a river crossing. By the time they made camp, everyone was exhausted and tempers short. Should have known better than to trust a Martinez with directions. Collins grumbled when Juan's shortcut proved longer than expected. "At least I can read a map, old man," Juan shot back. The argument escalated quickly, old grievances surfacing. Margaret watched Samuel's jaw tighten, saw him preparing to intervene with force if necessary. Instead, she stood and began singing. It was an old hymn her mother had taught her, simple and soothing. Her voice wasn't particularly fine, but it cut through the anger like a blade. One by one, the others fell silent. Ellen Henderson joined in on the second verse, then Paul. Even Collins hummed along grudgingly. When the song ended, the tension had dissipated. Juan and Collins retreated to opposite sides of the camp. But the crisis had passed. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Samuel asked later, as they checked the horses. "A church choir in St. Louis. The director used to say music could calm savage beasts." She smiled. Seemed worth trying on ranchers. He laughed, the first time she'd heard him truly laugh. It transformed his face, erasing years of grief and worry. "You're full of surprises, Margaret Hayes." They reached Dodge City on the third day. The town sprawled before them, busy and prosperous. Everything Dust Hollow wasn't. Yet Margaret found herself missing the quiet simplicity of their little community. The cattle buyer was satisfied with the quality, paying the promised price without haggling. The ranchers celebrated that night in the hotel saloon, toasting their success and, miraculously, each other's health. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully in Ellen's blue suit and accompanied Samuel to the farmer's bank. The meeting went better than she dared hope. The bankers, impressed by her organization and documentation, offered terms that would have seemed impossible months ago. "You've created something special," the bank president told her. "This kind of cooperation, it's the future of ranching. We'd be proud to support it." Afterward, walking back to the hotel, Samuel caught her arm. "Margaret, wait." She turned to face him on the boardwalk, aware of people passing, of propriety, of everything that stood between them. "I need to say something," he began. "These past months, you've changed everything, the ranch, the town, me. I know I'm not much of a prospect, a widower with a failing ranch and more pride than sense. But Samuel Morgan," she interrupted, heart pounding. "Are you trying to propose to me on a public street?" He flushed. "I'm making a mess of it." "Yes," she agreed. "You are." Then softer. "Ask me again when we're home, when the stars are out and I'm not wearing my business clothes." Hope bloomed in his eyes. "Is that a yes?" "That's a ask me properly and find out." They returned to Dust Hollow to find the town transformed. News of their success had spread. The saloon was full, the general store busy, children playing in streets that had been near empty months before. That evening there was an impromptu celebration in the town square. Someone brought out a fiddle, couples danced, and for the first time in years, Dust Hollow felt alive. Margaret stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Samuel dance with little Maria Martinez while Juan clapped along. The feuds weren't forgotten, but they were fading, replaced by something stronger: shared purpose, mutual success, community. "You did this," Ellen Henderson said, joining her. "You saved us all." "We saved ourselves," Margaret corrected. "I just reminded you how—" As the music played and the stars emerged, Margaret felt a deep contentment. She'd come to Dust Hollow with nothing but desperation and a willingness to work. She'd found purpose, community, and her eyes found Samuel across the square, perhaps something more. The cooperative's first venture had succeeded beyond anyone's dreams. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. But tonight, Dust Hollow was alive with possibility, and so was she. The stage from Denver arrived on a cold December morning, its wheels cutting deep ruts in the frost-hardened mud of Dust Hollow's main street. Margaret was in the general store, negotiating next month's feed orders with Paul Henderson, when young Tom Brennan burst through the door. "Miss Hayes, there's a fancy gentleman asking for you at the hotel." Margaret's blood ran cold. In her months at Dust Hollow, she'd received no visitors, no correspondence from her old life. She'd been content to let St. Louis fade into memory. "Did he give a name?" she asked, carefully keeping her voice steady. "A Jonathan something, dressed like a banker, talks like one too." "Jonathan Reed." Margaret's hands clenched involuntarily. Reed Industries had been the parent company of Hartwell and Associates, her former employer. What could they possibly want with her now? She found him in the hotel's small parlor, looking utterly out of place in his tailored suit and polished shoes. Jonathan Reed was younger than she remembered, perhaps 35, with the sleek confidence of a man who'd never known real hardship. "Miss Hayes," he rose, extending a manicured hand. "You're quite difficult to find." "Mr. Reed," she didn't take his hand. "I wasn't aware anyone was looking." His smile didn't waver. "Please sit. We have business to discuss." "I have no business with Reed Industries." "Ah, but Reed Industries has business with you. Or rather, with this charming example of agricultural cooperation you've created." He gestured to a folder on the table. "We've been following your success with great interest." Margaret's unease deepened. "How did you—" "The Farmers Bank in Dodge City. We hold a significant stake. They mentioned your remarkable work here." He opened the folder, revealing documents she recognized, copies of the cooperative's agreements, financial projections, even personal information about the member ranchers. "You've been investigating us." "Conducting due diligence," he corrected smoothly. "Reed Industries is expanding into agricultural investment. What you've built here, it's exactly the model we're looking for. Small ranchers, properly organized and capitalized, can be quite profitable." "We're not for sale, Mr. Reed." "Everything's for sale, Miss Hayes. It's simply a matter of price." He pulled out another document. "We're prepared to offer significant investment, enough to modernize operations, expand the herds, even build proper roads for transportation. In exchange, we'd take a controlling interest, say 60%. "Controlling interest." The words tasted bitter. "You mean ownership?" "Partnership. The ranchers would still work their land, still share in profits. They'd simply have guidance in major decisions." Margaret stood abruptly. "The answer is no. You haven't heard the full offer. There's also the matter of your position. Reed Industries would need someone to oversee local operations. Someone who understands both the business and the community." He named a salary that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "You'd have authority, resources, a real future, unless you prefer milking cows and keeping books in a dying town." "This town isn't dying, not anymore." "Thanks to you. But how long can it last without proper investment? What happens when drought comes or cattle prices fall? Your cooperative is held together by hope and handshakes. We're offering stability. You're offering servitude dressed up as salvation." Jonathan's expression hardened. "I'd hoped you'd be more reasonable. After all, your reputation in St. Louis. Well, let's say your options remain limited. This is a generous opportunity. My reputation was destroyed by men like you, Mr. Reed, men who cooked books and blamed the accountant when caught. I won't let you do the same to Dust Hollow. You think these ranchers are your friends, your family? You're their employee, Miss Hayes. When times get hard, and they will, do you think they'll choose you over survival? The words stung because they echoed her own fears, but Margaret lifted her chin. I guess we'll find out. Good day, Mr. Reed. She was at the door when he spoke again. This offer won't remain open indefinitely, and Reed Industries has other ways of achieving its goals. The Farmers' Bank, for instance. Those favorable terms could easily change. Margaret turned back. Are you threatening us? I'm explaining reality. Business is business, Miss Hayes. I'd hoped you understood that. She left without another word, but her hands shook as she walked back to the ranch. Reed Industries had resources, connections, power. The cooperative was strong, but could it survive a determined assault from a company that size? Samuel knew something was wrong the moment she entered the house. What is it? She told him everything, watching his expression darken with each detail. Damn vultures, he said when she finished. Waiting until we'd done the hard work, built something worth stealing. Hey, we need to tell the others, warn them. Tonight, emergency meeting. He was already reaching for his coat. I'll ride to the other ranches. The church was packed that evening. Word had spread quickly. A threat to one was a threat to all. Margaret stood before them, explaining Reed's offer and its implications. 60% ownership means they control everything, she said. What you plant, when you sell, who you hire. You'd be sharecroppers on your own land. But the investment? Paul Henderson looked troubled. New wells, better roads. We could use those things. At what cost? Juan Martinez demanded. My father fled Mexico to escape men who promised prosperity in exchange for freedom. I won't make his mistake. Easy for you to say, Collins shot back. Your ranch ain't mortgaged to the hilt. Arguments erupted across the room. Some saw opportunity in Reed's offer, others saw only danger. Margaret watched their fragile unity beginning to crack. Stop! Ellen Henderson's voice cut through the noise. You're doing exactly what they want, turning on each other. Ellen's right, Samuel said. One question is, what do we do about it? We could seek other investors, Margaret suggested. Ones who'd offer partnership without control. Where? Reed's got influence everywhere that matters. Then we grow slower, Margaret said firmly. Use our profits to improve gradually, and it'll take longer, but we'll own it free and clear. And if Reed makes good on his threat about the bank? She'd been thinking about that. We establish our own credit union, pool resources, make loans to each other, cut the banks out entirely. The room fell silent. It was audacious, perhaps impossible. But it was also exactly the kind of bold thinking that had saved them before. You're talking about us becoming our own bank? Paul asked slowly. I'm talking about true independence. It won't be easy. We'll need strict rules, careful management, but it's possible. The girl's got sand. I'll give her that, Collins muttered. They talked late into the night, hammering out details, addressing concerns. By the time they voted, it was unanimous. They would refuse Reed's offer and work toward creating their own financial institution. As people filed out, Samuel caught Margaret's arm. You all right? She wasn't. Reed's words about her limited options, about the ranchers choosing survival over loyalty, had found their mark, but she managed a smile. Just tired. Margaret, his voice was gentle. What aren't you telling me? The church had emptied except for them. In the soft lamplight, she found herself confessing her fears. What if he's right? What if I'm fooling myself thinking I belong here? You belong here more than anyone, Samuel said firmly. You've given us hope, direction, a future. That's not employment. Margaret, That's family. Family. The word warmed her. I've never really had that. Not since Father died. You have it now, if you want it. They stood close in the empty church, the weight of unspoken feelings heavy between them. Samuel reached up, touching her cheek gently. I was going to wait until spring. Do this proper like you asked. But with Reed sniffing around, making you doubt your place here. He took a breath. Margaret Hayes, would you consider marrying a stubborn rancher with more debts than sense? Despite everything, she laughed. That's your idea of a proper proposal? I'm out of practice. His thumb traced her cheekbone. But I mean every word. Marry me. Not because the town needs you. Not because the ranch needs you. Because I need you. Because I love you. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Samuel. You don't have to answer now. Just think about it. Know that you have a place here always. Not as an employee, as my wife, if you'll have me. She kissed him then, there in the little church where she'd brought enemies together and built a community. When they parted, both were breathless. Is that a yes? He asked hopefully. That's a Reed Industries can go to hell, she said. And also yes. He laughed, pulling her close. That's my girl. They walked home under stars bright with winter cold, hands linked, hearts full. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Reed wouldn't give up easily. The credit union would take all their combined strength to establish. There would be setbacks, conflicts, moments of doubt. But tonight, Margaret Hayes had chosen her future. Not the safe path Reed offered. Not the return to city life and steady salary. She'd chosen struggle and uncertainty and the chance to build something real with people who'd become family. She'd chosen love over fear, community over comfort, Samuel over safety. And she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. Margaret's departure from Dust Hollow came on a bitter January morning, 3 weeks after Jonathan Reed's visit. She stood in her small room, folding her few possessions into the same worn valise she'd arrived with, trying not to think about what she was leaving behind. The decision hadn't come suddenly. Reed Industries had made good on their threats. The Farmers' Bank had called in several loans, citing irregularities in the cooperative structure. 2 smaller ranchers, faced with immediate foreclosure, had accepted Reed's buyout offer. The unity she'd worked so hard to build was crumbling. You can't fix this by leaving, Samuel said from the doorway. He'd been arguing with her for days, ever since she'd announced her intention to return to St. Louis. I can't fix it by staying either. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see the hurt in his eyes. Reed wants me gone. Maybe if I leave, he'll leave the rest of you alone. You don't believe that? She didn't. But the alternative, watching everything she'd built destroyed, seeing Samuel lose his ranch because of her, was unbearable. The stage leaves in an hour, she said quietly. Margaret, please. He crossed the room, turning her to face him. We'll fight this together, all of us. The cooperative is falling apart. The Sawyers sold yesterday. Collins is meeting with Reed's lawyers tomorrow. She pulled away. I've done enough damage. Oh, damage. You saved this town. And now I'm destroying it. Reed's here because of me, because of what I built. If you hadn't, we'd have lost everything months ago. His hands gripped her shoulders. You gave us hope, Margaret. You can't take that back now. She finally met his eyes, her own blurred with tears. What hope is there against Reed Industries? They have money, lawyers, influence. We have... What? Determination? It's not enough. Samuel, it was enough before we were fighting circumstances. Now we're fighting an enemy with unlimited resources. She touched his face gently. I won't watch them destroy you. Any of you. So you'll destroy yourself instead. Go back to a city where your reputation is ruined, where you have no friends, no future. I'll survive, I always do. Surviving isn't living, Margaret. Will Hartley appeared in the doorway. Stage is here, Miss Hayes. The ride to town was silent. Samuel drove, his jaw set, knuckles white on the reins. Margaret memorized every detail, the creak of the wagon, the vast prairie sky, the distant mountains, things she'd never see again. Half the town seemed to be gathered at the stage stop. Ellen Henderson pressed a wrapped package into her hands. Bread for the journey, and something else, for later. Juan Martinez stepped forward awkwardly. Señorita Hayes, you gave my children hope for a better future. We won't forget. Even Collins had come, grumbling about the cold but pressing a worn dollar into her palm. For luck, he muttered. Gonna need it in the city. Young Tom Brennan was trying not to cry. Margaret hugged him briefly. Take care of Mr. Morgan, Tom. He'll need it. You could stay, the boy said desperately. We could hide you. Reed's men wouldn't find... Tom, she managed a smile. That's not how we solve problems, is it? The stage driver called for passengers. Margaret turned to Samuel one last time. He stood rigid, every line of his body speaking of barely controlled emotion. Samuel, Don't. His voice was rough. Just don't. She climbed into the stage, not trusting herself to speak. As it pulled away, she allowed herself one look back. The small crowd was already dispersing, but Samuel remained, a lone figure growing smaller with distance. Margaret closed her eyes and willed herself not to cry. St. Louis in January was gray buildings, gray sky, gray slush in the streets. Margaret found a boarding house that didn't ask questions and spent her first week walking familiar streets that now felt foreign. Her old apartment building had new tenants. The office where she'd worked for 6 years was now a millinery shop. Even the cafe where she'd taken lunch had changed hands. It was as if Margaret Hayes had never existed here. She applied for positions, but her reputation preceded her. Whispers followed. The accountant who'd exposed irregularities, who'd cost important men money. No one said it directly, but doors remained closed. By the 3rd week, her money was running low. The bread Ellen had given her was long gone, but she'd kept the other item, a small leather journal. She opened it one sleepless night to find it wasn't empty. Page after page of entries, different handwriting, all addressed to her. Miss Hayes, Margaret, you showed us that together we're stronger than apart. Don't forget that strength is still in you. Ellen Henderson. You taught my boys to read numbers, to see a future beyond these fields. That gift doesn't leave with you. Juan Martinez. Girls got more spine than sense, but that's what this town needed, what we all needed. Ed Collins. The ranch feels empty without you. Samuel doesn't say it, but he's lost without you. We all are. Come home. Will Hartley. The last entry was in Samuel's careful script. You think you're protecting us by leaving, but you're wrong. We're not whole without you. I'm not whole without you. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what family does. Come home. Margaret. Please. She cried then, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body. The nod home. When had Dust Hollow become home? When had those stubborn, difficult people become family? A knock interrupted her tears. Her landlady stood in the doorway, disapproval etched in every line of her face. Telegram for you. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. Cooperative stands. Reed retreating, your plan working. Come home. Her plan? She hadn't left any plan, unless She grabbed the journal, flipping back through the entries. There, a page she'd missed, covered in her own handwriting. Notes she'd made weeks ago about establishing a credit union, detailed steps, legal requirements. She must have left it behind accidentally. Or perhaps not so accidentally. Another knock. This time, her landlady looked genuinely concerned. "Miss Hayes, there's a delegation here to see you." Margaret followed her downstairs to find the boarding house parlor full of cowboys. Will Hartley, Tom Brennan, and 3 hands from neighboring ranches stood awkwardly among the delicate furniture. "Miss Hayes," Will said, hat in hand, "we've come to fetch you home." "How?" "Samuel sold 2 of his best horses to finance the trip. Said we weren't coming back without you." But Reed is discovering that Dust Hollow folks don't scare easy. Tom grinned. "When those bank fellows came to foreclose on the Hendersons, every rancher in the county showed up, just stood there, quiet-like, watching. Bank decided to reconsider." Will continued. "And that credit union idea of yours? Judge in Dodge City says it's legal. We've got near half the county signed up already. Reed's losing ground every day. But he has resources, and we have something he doesn't." Will's weathered face creased in a smile. "We have each other, and we should have you, if you'll come back." Margaret looked at these men who'd traveled hundreds of miles through winter weather to bring her home. Rough, simple men who understood loyalty in ways Jonathan Reed never would. "My reputation." "Your reputation is that you're the woman who saved Dust Hollow," Will said firmly. "That's the only reputation that matters." Tom stepped forward, holding out a folded paper. "Samuel sent this. Said to give it to you private, but..." He shrugged. "We all know what it says anyway." Margaret unfolded it with trembling hands. Inside was a deed, half ownership of the Morgan Ranch, already filed and legal. "You said you had nothing?" Samuel had written, "Now you own half of everything I have. That makes you a landowner. Margaret Hayes, a woman of property. Come home and claim it. Claim me. Claim the life we're building together." She looked up to find all the men carefully studying the ceiling, the walls, anything but her tear-streaked face. "When do we leave?" she asked. The journey back was nothing like her departure. The cowboys took turns telling her everything she'd missed, how the cooperative had rallied, how other towns were asking about their model, how even the governor had taken notice of their success. "Samuel's been like a man possessed," Will confided. "Working dawn to midnight, organizing everyone, fighting Reed at every turn. But his heart ain't in it, not without you." They reached Dust Hollow at sunset 3 days later. The whole town had gathered again, but this time the mood was celebratory. Banners stretched across Main Street. "Welcome home, Margaret." Samuel stood at the front of the crowd. He was thinner, shadows under his eyes, but his smile when he saw her was radiant. Margaret barely waited for the wagon to stop before jumping down. She ran to him, propriety forgotten, and threw her arms around his neck. "You impossible woman," he murmured into her hair. "Don't ever leave again." "I won't," she promised. "I'm home." The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone started music, and suddenly there was dancing in the street. Margaret found herself passed from partner to partner. Juan Martinez, Paul Henderson, even gruff Ed Collins took a turn. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Samuel drew her aside. "The credit union's working. Margaret, we've already made 3 loans to help smaller ranchers hold on. Reed's backed off, for now. His investors don't like fighting entire communities. And the cooperative? Stronger than ever. We have contracts through spring, new members joining weekly." He cupped her face gently. "But none of it meant anything without you?" "I was so scared," she admitted, scared I'd brought disaster to you all. You brought salvation and love and a future we never dreamed possible." He kissed her softly. "Marry me, Margaret, tomorrow. I don't want to waste another day." She laughed through her tears. "Tomorrow? That's hardly proper. I hang proper. We've got a preacher, witnesses, and a woman I love who owns half my ranch. What else do we need? A dress? Ellen's already working on it." Margaret looked around at the celebrating town, at the people who'd become family, at the man who'd shown her that home wasn't a place but a choice. "Tomorrow, then," she agreed. And there, in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by the community they'd built together, Samuel Morgan kissed his bride-to-be while Dust Hollow cheered its approval. She was home. The wedding took place on a crisp February morning in the little white church that had seen so many of their meetings. Ellen Henderson had worked through the night to alter her own wedding dress, and the other ranch wives had decorated the church with early prairie flowers and whatever greenery they could find. Margaret stood before the mirror in the church's small back room, hardly recognizing herself. The ivory dress transformed her from the practical bookkeeper into something softer, more radiant. Ellen pinned the last curl into place. "You're trembling," Ellen observed. "I've negotiated with bankers, faced down Reed Industries, learned to milk ornery cows." Margaret laughed shakily. "Why am I terrified of walking down an aisle? Because this matters more than all of that combined." Ellen squeezed her hands. "Samuel's a good man, Margaret. You've both been alone too long." A knock interrupted them. Will Hartley peered in. "You ready, Miss Margaret? Samuel's about to wear a hole in the floor up there." The church was packed. It seemed all of Dust Hollow and half the county had crowded in. As the organ began, Mrs. Collins had insisted on playing. Margaret walked down the aisle on Will's steady arm, her eyes finding Samuel immediately. He stood at the altar in his best suit, hair slicked back, hands clasped tightly in front of him. When he saw her, his whole face transformed with such naked joy that Margaret felt her nervousness evaporate. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with gentle humor, acknowledging the unusual speed of the wedding but noting that, when folks have faced fire together, they don't need years to know their hearts. When Samuel slipped the simple gold band on her finger, his mother's ring, he told her, Margaret saw his hands shake slightly. This strong man who'd faced drought and debt and corporate threats was trembling at marrying her. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Williams declared. "Well, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender, brief, appropriate for the setting, but the look they shared promised much more. The church erupted in cheers that could probably be heard in the next county. The reception spilled out of the church into the town square. Tables groaned under potluck contributions. Every family had brought something. Musicians appeared with fiddles and guitars. Even the February cold couldn't dampen the celebration. "Never thought I'd see the day," Ed Collins told anyone who'd listen. Samuel Morgan smiling like a fool and dancing in the street. Indeed, Samuel hadn't let Margaret go since the ceremony. They danced to every song, lost in their own world despite the crowd around them. "No regrets," he murmured during a slower tune. "Only that we waited so long," she replied. As evening approached, the newlyweds made their escape in a wagon decorated with ribbons and tin cans. The ranch hands had mysteriously disappeared for the night, giving them privacy. Margaret changed out of the wedding dress carefully, hanging it in what was now their shared bedroom. "It's not much of a honeymoon," Samuel apologized. "Come spring, maybe we could—" "Samuel," she placed a finger on his lips, "I'm exactly where I want to be." The next days passed in a blur of adjustment. Margaret moved her few belongings into the main house, learning to navigate this new intimacy. They worked side by side during the day, Samuel with the cattle, Margaret with the books and correspondence, and spent evenings by the fire, planning for spring, for the future, for possibilities that seemed endless now. It was 3 weeks later when everything changed again. Margaret was in town, meeting with the credit union board, when she saw the familiar figure climbing down from the stage. Her blood froze. But this wasn't Jonathan Reed. The man who approached her was older, more refined, with silver at his temples and an air of quiet authority. He removed his hat politely. "Mrs. Morgan? My name is Theodore Reed. I believe you've met my son." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her wedding ring. "Mr. Reed, if you're here to—" "I'm here to apologize." The words surprised her into silence. "And perhaps to make amends, if you'll allow it." They sat in the hotel parlor, the same room where Jonathan had made his threats. Theodore Reed was everything his son wasn't: thoughtful, measured, genuinely interested in what Margaret had built. "Jonathan acted without my knowledge," he explained. "I've built Reed Industries on partnership, not predation. When I learned what he'd attempted here," he shook his head. "He's young, ambitious, too eager to prove himself. I've reassigned him to our Boston office, where he can learn proper business ethics under closer supervision. And the threats, the bank loans, already addressed. I've personally guaranteed the original terms will be honored." He leaned forward. "Mrs. Morgan, what you've created here is remarkable. The cooperative model, the credit union. This is the future of American agriculture. I came to see it for myself." Margaret studied him warily. And I'd like to invest, not control, invest. Silent partnership, with the cooperative maintaining full autonomy. I believe what you're doing here could be replicated across the West, helping small ranchers survive and thrive. Why should we trust you? You shouldn't, not yet." He pulled out a card. "Take your time. Investigate me, my company, our practices. If you decide we might work together, contact me. If not, you'll never hear from us again." After he left, Margaret sat stunned. She found Samuel at the stockyard and told him everything. "Could be a trick," he said, but thoughtfully rather than dismissively. "It could be. Or it could be the opportunity we need to really grow to help other towns like ours." They called another meeting. The debate was fierce. Trust still came hard after recent threats. But Margaret had done her research. Theodore Reed's reputation was solid, his business practices ethical. "We take it slow," she proposed. "Small investment first. See how he handles it. Any sign of interference, we end it." The vote was close, but they agreed to explore the possibility. Theodore Reed proved as good as his word. The initial investment came with no strings, no demands. He even sent agricultural experts at his expense to advise on breeding programs and crop rotation. By late spring, the transformation was remarkable. The credit union had helped 5 families avoid foreclosure. The cooperative had contracts with military posts in 3 states. Other towns sent delegations to learn their methods. Margaret stood on the hill overlooking the ranch one evening in May, Samuel's arms around her from behind. The pastures were green with spring grass, the cattle healthy and multiplying. In the distance, she could see the lights of Dust Hollow, more lights than ever before as new families moved in, drawn by opportunity. "You did this," Samuel murmured into her hair. "We did this," she corrected. "All of us." "I have something to tell you," he said, turning her to face him. Will heard from his cousin in Colorado. There's a town there, lot like Dust Hollow was. Dying. Desperate. They want to know if we could send someone to help them organize. Margaret's heart leaped. "Samuel, that's wonderful. Who will you send?" "I was thinking Tom. He's learned a lot, and he's young enough to make the journey easily." Tom's a good choice. He's grown so much this year. There's just one problem. Samuel's eyes twinkled. He'll need a teacher. Someone who understands the books, the organizing, the negotiating. Well, I could write detailed instructions. Or you could go with him, just for a few weeks, help them get started. He pulled her closer. I know it's a lot to ask, especially now, but... Now? Why especially now? He looked at her strangely. Margaret, haven't you noticed? The sickness in the mornings? The way certain smells bother you suddenly? She stared at him, comprehension dawning. You think I'm... Ellen thinks so too. Says you have the look. His hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach. So maybe Colorado can wait. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. A child. After all Samuel's loss, all their struggles, new life was growing. Definitely Colorado can wait, she agreed, laughing through her tears. They stood together as the sun set over their land, their town, their future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Colorado project would happen eventually. Other towns would need help. The cooperative would continue to grow and face new obstacles. But tonight, Margaret Morgan stood in her husband's arms, her hand over his on her stomach, and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From desperate, unemployed city girl to ranch wife, from outsider to the heart of a community, from alone to surrounded by family. No regrets? Samuel asked, echoing his wedding day question. Only one, Margaret said. I should have asked for that job sooner. He laughed, spinning her around before setting her down gently, mindful of her condition. Come on, Mrs. Morgan, let's go home. Ellen's organizing another celebration, and if we don't show soon, she'll send Will to fetch us. Another celebration? What for this time? Spring, success, new life. He kissed her softly. The fact that a humble city girl asked for work and changed everything? Hand in hand. They walked down the hill toward the warm lights of home, toward the future they'd built together, toward all the possibilities that awaited when people chose community over isolation, love over fear, and hope over despair. The stars were coming out over Dust Hollow, and Margaret Morgan was exactly where she belonged. The harvest celebration of 1887 would be remembered in Dust Hollow for generations. The town square overflowed with tables laden with food. Banners stretched between buildings, and Chinese lanterns Ellen Henderson had ordered from San Francisco cast warm light as evening fell. Margaret Morgan stood at the edge of the dancing area, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching the celebration with deep satisfaction. Little Sarah toddled after the Henderson boys, her dark curls bouncing the same curls as her father's. At 2 years old, she had Samuel's serious eyes but Margaret's determined chin. "Mama, dance," Sarah demanded, running back to tug at Margaret's skirt. "Mama's resting, little one," Samuel said, scooping up his daughter. "But Papa will dance with you." Margaret smiled, watching them spin to the fiddle music. The transformation in Samuel still took her breath away sometimes. The grieving, closed-off rancher she'd first met had become this: a laughing father, a community leader, a man who wore joy as easily as his work clothes. "Never thought I'd see this day," a voice said beside her. Ed Collins, now nearing 80, leaned heavily on his cane. "This town full of life again. My grandson Bobby running his own spread thanks to the credit union. And you about to bring another little one into the world. We've all come far, Mr. Collins. Some farther than others." He patted her arm with surprising gentleness. "That first day you showed up, asking about work, I laughed at you. Fool that I was. You saved us all, Margaret Morgan." Before she could respond, Tom Brennan appeared. No longer the gangly boy, but a confident young man of 20. "Mrs. Morgan, the Colorado folks are here." "Indeed." A delegation from Willow Creek, the Colorado town they'd helped organize 2 years prior, had arrived for the celebration. Margaret had trained Tom and 2 others to spread the cooperative model, and now 5 towns across 3 states operated on the principles Dust Hollow had pioneered. Margaret, Anna Schultz, Willow Creek's first female cooperative board member, embraced her carefully. "I had to come thank you in person. We've paid off half our debts already. My daughter's going to school instead of working the fields. It's all because of what you started." The evening continued with testimonies like Anna's. Ranchers from across the region spoke of mortgages saved, children educated, communities rebuilt. The credit union had grown beyond their wildest dreams, offering not just loans but education programs Margaret had designed, teaching accounting to ranch wives, business principles to young men like Tom. Theodore Reed had arrived that morning, as he did twice yearly to review his investments. But he came now as a friend, his partnership having proved as ethical as promised. His funding had helped build the new schoolhouse, establish a medical clinic, and create a scholarship fund for promising young people to attend college. "My son sends his regards," Theodore told Margaret during a quiet moment. "And his apologies. Again. He's actually doing well in Boston, learned some hard lessons about the difference between exploitation and partnership." "People can change," Margaret said simply. "Dust Hollow taught me that." As if to prove her point, Juan Martinez approached with his eldest son Miguel, the same young man who'd once courted Samuel's first wife. Any awkwardness from that history had long since faded. "Mrs. Morgan, Miguel has something to ask you," Juan said, pride evident in his voice. Miguel, now 25 and married himself, held his hat nervously. "I've been accepted to the State Agricultural College, ma'am, but I want to study more than farming. I want to learn what you know, the books, the organizing, the business side. Could you teach me before I go?" "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "Come by Monday, we'll start with basic ledgers." As the evening progressed, Samuel found Margaret sitting on a bench, Sarah asleep in her arms. "You need to rest," he said, settling beside them. "Ellen says the baby could come any day now." "I'm fine, just thinking." About circles. How I came here with nothing but desperation and a willingness to work. Now look." She gestured at the thriving celebration. "It's like ripples in a pond, spreading outward. You dropped the stone that started those ripples. We all did, every choice to trust instead of fear, to work together instead of alone." She shifted Sarah's weight. "I got a letter yesterday from St. Louis." Samuel tensed. Even after 5 years, mentions of her old life made him wary. "The Hartwell and Associates is reforming under new management. They want to hire me as a consultant, help them rebuild their reputation." "Margaret." "I already wrote back declining," she said quickly. "But I recommended someone, Mrs. Patterson from Willow Creek. She's got the skills and needs the opportunity." Samuel relaxed. "Ripples spreading outward." Exactly. The music had shifted to a slower tempo. Couples swayed together in the lantern light. The Hendersons, the Martinezes, even Will Hartley with the widow Mrs. Davies he'd been courting. "Dance with me," Samuel said suddenly. "Samuel, I'm the size of a barn." "You're beautiful. Dance with me." He helped her stand, took sleeping Sarah and settled her in Ellen's waiting arms, then led Margaret to the dance floor. They moved slowly, carefully, her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember," he murmured, "that on that first morning, you in your city dress trying to milk Bessie? She nearly kicked me. You were so determined, jaw set, refusing to give up even when the milk went everywhere but the pail. His arms tightened around her. That's when I started falling in love with you, I think. Watching you refuse to be defeated by a cow. Margaret laughed softly. And when did you know for sure? The meeting where you sang stopped Collins and Martinez from killing each other with a hymn. He pulled back to look at her. You brought music back to this place, Margaret, in every way possible. A sudden twinge made her gasp. What is it? Is it time? No, I don't think. Another stronger contraction cut off her words. Ellen, Samuel called, his voice carrying a note of panic that made several heads turn. What followed was organized chaos. Ellen Henderson took charge, sending Samuel for the doctor and organizing the women. Margaret found herself whisked to the clinic, the same one her efforts had helped fund. Labor was long but uncomplicated. As dawn broke over Dust Hollow, Margaret delivered a healthy son, Samuel, allowed in once the danger passed, stared at the baby with wonder. He's perfect, he whispered. What should we name him? Margaret asked, exhausted but euphoric. William, Samuel said without hesitation. After Will, and Theodore, after the man who gave us a second chance, William Theodore Morgan. Little Will, Margaret agreed, touching the baby's impossibly small fingers. The news spread quickly. By afternoon, it seemed the entire county had stopped by with congratulations and gifts. The cooperative board officially declared the day a holiday. Someone hung a banner. Welcome to Dust Hollow, William Morgan. That evening, with visitors finally gone, the Morgan family gathered in Margaret's room. Sarah, initially suspicious of the newcomer, had decided the baby was acceptable and sat carefully beside her mother, patting his head with gentle if slightly sticky hands. Mama's baby, she announced proprietarily. Our baby, Samuel corrected. Your brother. Margaret looked at her family, her husband, her daughter, her new son, and felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. Through the window, she could see the lights of Dust Hollow, hear the distant sounds of continued celebration. I need to check the books tomorrow, she said drowsily. The quarterly reports are due, and Tom needs those instructions for the Wyoming project. The books can wait, Samuel said firmly. The town can manage without you for a few days. But Margaret Morgan, you've given this town your mind, your heart, your sweat and tears. Let us give you something back. Rest, heal, be with your family. She wanted to argue but found she couldn't. For once, the unstoppable force that was Margaret Morgan allowed herself to stop. As night fell over Dust Hollow, the Morgan family settled in for their first night as four. Outside, the town continued its celebration, music and laughter floating on the prairie wind. The credit union was thriving, the cooperative expanding, new businesses opening monthly. Children who might have grown up in poverty were in school. Families who'd faced foreclosure were prospering. All because one desperate woman had asked for work and refused to accept failure. Thank you, Samuel whispered in the darkness, baby Will sleeping between them. Sarah curled against Margaret's side. For what? For asking for that job, for staying when it got hard, for believing we could be more than we were. Margaret reached across their children to touch his face. Thank you for taking a chance on a city girl who couldn't milk a cow. Best chance I ever took. As sleep claimed her. Margaret thought about circles again, how she'd arrived with nothing and now had everything. How a dying town had found new life. How strangers had become family, enemies had become partners, and despair had transformed into hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Will would need feeding. Sarah would demand attention. The cooperative would face new obstacles. Other towns would seek their help. But tonight, in a room filled with love in a town built on trust, Margaret Morgan knew she was exactly where she belonged. The humble girl who'd asked for work had indeed changed a cowboy's town. But more than that, the town had changed her, shaped her, given her purpose and family and home. And as Dust Hollow settled into peaceful sleep, its future bright with possibility. Margaret Morgan smiled and pulled her family closer. She was home,